In the autumn of 1944, the northwestern sector of the Eastern Front was no longer a continuous line, but a series of shrinking corridors and coastal enclaves. After Operation Bagration in June-August 1944 destroyed most of German Army Group Center, Soviet forces pushed west through Belarus and Lithuania, reaching the approaches to East Prussia and the Baltic coast. What remained of Army Group North held Latvia and parts of Lithuania and Estonia. Its formations stretched along the Gulf of Riga and dependent on a single land corridor running south toward East Prussia. For Berlin, this corridor sustained nearly an entire army group and preserved access to Baltic ports and naval bases. For the Soviet High Command, it was a vulnerable link that could be cut. The Baltic region carried significance beyond its local geography. Since 1941, German control of ports such as Riga, Libau and Memel had supported naval operations, U-boat training, and the movement of supplies and evacuees across the Baltic Sea. The area also shielded the northern flank of East Prussia and the approaches to Königsberg. Soviet planners, in turn, viewed the liberation of the Baltic republics as both a political objective and a military necessity, removing German airfields and naval bases that threatened Soviet sea lanes and cities such as Leningrad. By September 1944, 3 Soviet fronts, 1st, 2nd and 3rd Baltic, were assigned to this theatre, fielding multiple combined arms armies with attached tank and air formations under commanders, including Ivan Bagramian and Andrei Yeryomenko. Intelligence on both sides emphasized the fragility of the German position. German staff officers recognized that Army Group North, with roughly several 100,000 troops organized around 16th and 18th armies, depended on the communications axis through Šiauliai and Memel to maintain contact with Army Group Center and the Reich. Soviet assessments identified the same axis as the key to isolating German forces in Latvia and along the Baltic coast. The destruction of Army Group Center had already forced the Germans to divert divisions northward to stabilize the front, weakening other sectors and limiting reserves. Public sentiment and political calculations added further layers. In Germany, official propaganda still described the Eastern Front as a coherent defensive wall and highlighted the Baltic as a barrier protecting the homeland and allied states. In the Soviet Union, press reports framed the advance into the Baltic as the liberation of Soviet republics occupied since 1941 and as a step toward pushing German forces out of Eastern Europe. For Latvian, Lithuanian and Estonian civilians, the shifting front lines meant a second change of occupying power in 4 years. Some groups prepared to withdraw with German forces westward. Others anticipated the return of Soviet authority with concern or hope, depending on their earlier experiences. By early October 1944, the situation narrowed to a concrete operational dilemma. If the Red Army could break through to the Baltic Sea near Memel, Army Group North would lose its land connection to East Prussia and become dependent on sea supply. German planners debated whether to withdraw in time to avoid such an encirclement, while the Oberkommando des Heers weighed the risks of abandoning large parts of the Baltic coastline. At the same time, Soviet Stavka orders to 1st Baltic Front defined a clear goal: advance toward Memel and the coast, sever the corridor, and prevent organized German withdrawal. The next phase would transform maps and estimates into a deliberate attempt to create what later became known as the Courland Pocket. On October 5, 1944, the offensive that aimed to cut the German land corridor to the Baltic opened with a concentrated artillery preparation along selected sectors west of Šiauliai and north toward the Nemunas Basin. 1st Baltic Front, under Colonel General Ivan Bagramian, committed several combined arms armies in echelon, with rifle divisions in the first wave and tank and mechanized corps held back for exploitation. On some stretches of the front, Soviet planners massed more than 100 guns and mortars per kilometer, supported by assault aircraft, tasked with striking German command posts and road junctions. The objective of the opening phase was limited but decisive: rupture the German front, disrupt reserves, and create conditions for a fast drive toward Memel and the Baltic coast. Opposing them, German formations responsible for the corridor combined elements of 3rd Panzer Army and Army Group North. The front line was held by infantry divisions, many under strength after summer losses, supported by a smaller number of Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units. Commanders tried to compensate for numerical inferiority with dense field fortifications, anti-tank positions sited along likely approaches, and local counterattack groups formed around available armoured vehicles. On maps, staff officers identified several defensive belts and river lines to be held in sequence. In the field, the opening artillery fire and Soviet infantry assaults quickly made the situation more fluid than planned. The first day brought a pattern that repeated in several sectors. Soviet rifle regiments, advancing behind rolling barrages, penetrated forward trenches and village strongpoints, sometimes covering several kilometers before hitting organized resistance. In response, German battalion and regimental groups attempted immediate counterthrusts, often supported by a handful of tanks or assault guns. In some areas, these local actions sealed off or delayed Soviet gains. In others, they were forced back with losses when Soviet anti-tank guns and close air support intervened. Both sides reported heavy expenditure of ammunition and noted the difficulty of coordinating infantry, armour and artillery in a landscape of forests, fields and small rivers. For soldiers on the ground, the offensive appeared in more fragmented form than high-level orders implied. Soviet units reported rapid advances into partially abandoned forward zones, followed by sudden fire from concealed positions. German field reports described strong pressure on multiple sectors and difficulties in maintaining telephone lines and radio contact. Supply and medical services on both sides had to adapt to roads congested by troop movements and refugees. Lithuanian civilians in towns and villages along the axis of advance saw columns moving in opposite directions. German administrative personnel and some local collaborators withdrawing westward. Soviet reconnaissance elements appearing soon after. Within the first 48 hours, Soviet operational reports indicated several breaches in the main defensive belt and the capture of key road junctions. This created the opportunity to introduce mobile groups intended to widen and deepen the breakthrough. The German command, in turn, began to speak in terms of delaying actions and elastic defence, rather than rigidly holding every position. Requests for reinforcement and permission to shorten the line increased, but decisions on major withdrawals remained tied to instructions from higher headquarters that still considered the land corridor strategically important. The opening phase thus set the pattern for the days ahead. Tactical flexibility in the field, constrained by strategic directives that sought to preserve both territory and formations, while facing an adversary explicitly aiming to reach the sea. In Stavka planning documents for the autumn campaign, the corridor between East Prussia and Army Group North was treated not as a separate front, but as a vulnerable hinge. The directive to 1st Baltic Front in late September 1944 set out two clear objectives. First, to break the German line west of WWII and drive toward Memel. Second, to reach the Baltic coast and thereby sever the land link to German forces in Latvia. To support this, the front assembled several combined arms armies and a tank corps with a total of roughly 250,000 to 300,000 personnel, several thousand guns and mortars, and several hundred tanks and self-propelled guns concentrated on a relatively narrow operational sector. Air support from the 3rd Air Army was tasked with interdiction of rail lines and road traffic behind the German front. Soviet planners envisaged the operation in phases. The first phase would create tactical breaches, the second would deepen them into an operational breakthrough, and the third would exploit success with mobile formations driving rapidly toward the coast. Coordination with neighbouring fronts was built into the plan. Second and Third Baltic fronts were to increase pressure along their sectors, preventing the Germans from disengaging major forces to seal the gap. Logistically, this required moving ammunition and fuel forward along damaged railways and roads that had only recently been rebuilt after earlier fighting. Depot locations, field repair workshops, and bridging units were pre-assigned to support a rapid pursuit once the German line began to dissolve. On the German side, strategic aims were more conflicted. Army Group North, with roughly 400,000 to 500,000 troops in Latvia and northern Lithuania, depended on the land route through Memel, not only for supplies, but also as a potential evacuation corridor if ordered to withdraw. The staff of Army Group North and the Army High Command proposed shortening the front by withdrawing to more defensible lines closer to East Prussia, preserving manpower and equipment. These proposals clashed with directives from Adolf Hitler, who ordered that the Baltic positions be held as shield for East Prussia and as bases for continued naval and air operations. Any withdrawal that abandoned large territories was considered politically and symbolically unacceptable. Operational plans therefore tried to reconcile these constraints. The German 3rd Panzer Army and elements of Army Group North were instructed to hold successive defensive belts, conduct limited counterattacks to restore local situations, and delay any Soviet penetration long enough for reserves to be shifted. Defensive preparations included minefields, anti-tank ditches, and strongpoints in villages and woods. Panzer and assault gun units, numbering only a few dozen operational vehicles in some sectors, were reserved for counterstrikes against any Soviet breakthrough. Rail movements were scheduled to bring additional units from other fronts, but capacity and fuel shortages limited what could be achieved. Propaganda on both sides presented these preparations in simplified terms. German communications to troops and civilians framed the Baltic as a forward barrier protecting the Reich, emphasizing the duty to hold ground. Soviet press reports, in contrast, highlighted the liberation of Baltic territories and referred to the intention to cut off German forces from their bases. For many Latvian and Lithuanian civilians, the competing messages underlined the uncertainty of their situation. Each side claimed strategic necessity, while local concerns centered on property, conscription, and the prospect of renewed Soviet rule. Within this framework, the decision not to evacuate Army Group North before the October offensive amounted to a strategic bet. German commanders in the field prepared contingency plans for partial withdrawals and breakout options, but their implementation depended on political approval that did not come. Soviet planners, aware that the window for cutting the corridor might be limited if the enemy disengaged in time, placed particular emphasis on speed once a breach was achieved. The encounter between these opposing calculations, holding versus cutting, symbolically important positions versus operational maneuver, would shape the course of the coming battles and the emergence of an isolated pocket on the Baltic shore. As the October offensive unfolded, the first engagements began to convert operational diagrams into tangible changes on the ground. Between 5 and 7 October, Soviet rifle divisions of 1st Baltic Front pressed westward along several axes, exploiting gaps created by artillery preparation and night assaults. Units advanced through fields and low wooded hills toward road centres that German command had marked as key for lateral movement. Small towns with rail sidings, river crossings and road junctions. In some sectors, Soviet regiments reported advances of 8 to 10 kilometres in 2 days. In others, progress was measured in the capture of a single village that controlled a bridge or crossroads. German frontline formations responded with a combination of local counterattacks and stepwise withdrawals. Infantry battalions, often reduced to a few hundred men, formed Kampfgruppen with attached assault guns or tanks where available. These groups attempted to strike Soviet spearheads on the flanks as they emerged from forests or crossed open ground. In a number of cases, such counterblows temporarily restored segments of the line or delayed Soviet advances long enough to evacuate supply depots and staff elements. However, each engagement consumed ammunition and reduced the already limited pool of armoured vehicles and experienced infantry. The terrain imposed its own structure on the fighting. Rivers and drainage channels, bordered by marshy banks, became natural defensive lines. Soviet assault units used pontoons and improvised crossings under covering fire, while German engineers destroyed bridges and laid additional mines on likely approach routes. Villages, often consisting of a single main street and farm outbuildings, were turned into strongpoints with interlocking fields of machine gun and anti-tank fire. Clearing such localities required coordinated use of infantry, direct fire artillery, and, where possible, close air support. Casualties in these engagements were significant on both sides. Soviet divisions reported hundreds of killed and wounded in taking fortified localities, while German after-action reports noted companies reduced by half during attempts to hold or retake them. For the soldiers involved, the first week of the operation was experienced less as a continuous advance or retreat, and more as a succession of intense local battles. Soviet platoon and company commanders reported difficulty maintaining contact with neighbouring units in forested areas, leading to concerns about exposed flanks and isolated forward elements. German commanders described the challenge of repositioning scarce reserves along poor roads under constant artillery harassment and air attack. The psychological effect of repeated attacks and counterattacks, combined with limited rest and the approach of colder weather, affected morale on both sides in ways that do not appear in formal operational summaries but are reflected in letters and diary entries. Civilians in the path of these early engagements encountered both armies in rapid succession. Lithuanian villages might see German rear area personnel passing through with carts and vehicles, followed hours or days later by Soviet reconnaissance detachments. Some residents attempted to leave with German columns, fearing reprisals or new requisitions. Others remained, hoping to preserve homes and livestock. Requisitioning of food, draft animals and buildings for headquarters or medical stations by both sides added to local hardship. Administrative shifts, German offices closing, Soviet field commandants appearing, occurred in parallel with ongoing artillery fire, audible in the distance. By 8 to 9 October, patterns emerged that indicated the broader operational impact of these first clashes. Soviet breakthroughs along several sectors had forced German command to commit mobile reserves piecemeal, reducing the possibility of a concentrated counterstroke. Road traffic westward increased, not only with military units, but also with columns of wagons carrying equipment and documents from evacuated offices. Reports from German staff officers to higher headquarters began to refer to the growing difficulty of maintaining a continuous front and the risk that Soviet forces could turn tactical gains into a deeper penetration. On the Soviet side, situation reports highlighted widening gaps between German formations and recommended timely introduction of tank and mechanized units to accelerate the drive toward the coast. The initial engagements thus prepared the conditions for a transition from positional fighting to a more fluid phase in which the question would be not only how far Soviet forces could advance, but whether they could reach the Baltic shoreline before German formations disengaged in an orderly way. By 9th to 10th October, the operation entered a more intense phase. Breaches that had begun as narrow gaps now widened into sectors where German units could no longer maintain continuous lines. Rifle divisions of the 1st Baltic Front, supported by attached tank and self-propelled gun regiments, pushed beyond the initial defensive belt towards secondary positions that had been only partially prepared. In several directions, forward detachments advanced 20 to 30 kilometers from their start lines, reaching roads that German staffs had relied on for lateral movement and supply. The tempo of fighting increased as both sides committed reserves. Soviet commanders fed fresh battalions into the lead. while German divisions stripped rear area and support units to reinforce threatened points. Escalation brought corresponding logistical challenges. Soviet supply troops had to move large quantities of artillery ammunition and fuel over roads damaged by previous fighting and air attacks. Bridging units worked under fire to replace destroyed crossings, while repair teams tried to keep vehicles operational in conditions of heavy use and limited spare parts. Air support intensified, with Soviet aircraft striking rail junctions and columns identified by reconnaissance, seeking to disrupt the flow of German reinforcements. German attempts to repair tracks, reroute trains, and move units at night could not fully compensate for the cumulative impact of interdiction. On the German side, the sense of crisis deepened in command reports. Army and Army Group headquarters received increasing numbers of messages indicating broken communications, units cut off or outflanked, and growing difficulties in holding designated lines. Staff officers warned that if Soviet spearheads continued to advance at existing rates, the land connection between forces in Latvia and those in East Prussia could be severed within days. Proposals circulated for a controlled withdrawal from exposed positions in northern Lithuania and parts of Latvia to consolidate nearer to East Prussia, preserving divisions for future defence. These proposals encountered political limits. Orders from higher authority reiterated that the Baltic coastal area was to be held, both for its military value and for its role in maintaining sea lanes and airfields. Commanders were instructed to conduct elastic defence, but not to abandon key ports or allow a general retreat that might be interpreted as loss of control. The result was a pattern in which senior field commanders recognized the operational risk of encirclement, but lacked approval for the scale of withdrawal they considered necessary. Local decisions to pull back had to be justified as tactical measures rather than elements of a larger redeployment. For civilians, the escalation translated into more visible signs of dislocation. Columns of German administrative personnel, wounded soldiers and civilians moved westward by road, competing for limited transport and space on rail lines. Latvian and Lithuanian residents faced conflicting pressures. Some were urged or ordered to evacuate as frontline positions approached, while others remained in place due to lack of means or uncertainty about future authority. Rumours about possible sea evacuation from Baltic ports spread, accompanied by concerns about space on ships, priority for military personnel, and the fate of those left behind. Internationally, these developments were observed with limited direct influence. Governments in exile of Baltic states monitored reports but had no capacity to affect military decisions on the ground. Soviet political organs, accompanying the front, prepared to re-establish administrative structures in recaptured areas and to identify individuals associated with previous German occupation. German naval and air commands evaluated the possibility of sustaining isolated forces by sea if the land corridor were lost, calculating tonnage, ship availability, and vulnerability to Soviet air and submarine attacks. By the evening of October 10th, situation maps at both Soviet and German headquarters showed a rapidly narrowing connection between the forces in Latvia and those nearer to East Prussia. Soviet spearheads were approaching lines of communication that, if cut, would transform a stretched corridor into a closed pocket. German reports increasingly used formulations such as danger of severance and urgent need for decision, indicating awareness that the window for an orderly withdrawal was closing. At the same time, formal orders still emphasized holding positions and preparing limited counterattacks, reflecting the tension between operational assessments in the field and strategic directives from higher command. This combination of accelerating military pressure and constrained decision-making framed the crisis that would culminate in Soviet units reaching the Baltic coast and isolating large German formations to the north. On October 10th, the offensive reached its decisive phase. Before dawn, Soviet artillery again concentrated on the narrowest section of the remaining corridor, where roads from the interior of Lithuania converged toward Memel and the East Prussian border. Rifle divisions that had spent the night regrouping at the forward edge of the German positions stepped off in dense autumn mist, supported by assault guns and attached tank units. Their task was no longer only to push the enemy back, but to drive a wedge all the way to the Baltic Sea, transforming a thinning strip of territory into a physical barrier between German forces in Latvia and those in East Prussia. German command reacted by committing the bulk of its mobile reserves to this sector. Panzer and Panzergrenadier formations withdrawn from quieter fronts, together with assault gun brigades, were ordered to counterattack into the flanks of the Soviet thrust. For a limited time, this created one of the largest concentrations of armour the corridor had seen since summer. On several axes, German tanks and self-propelled guns struck advancing Soviet columns as they emerged from wooded areas or crossed open fields, forcing some units to take cover or fall back. Reports from both sides described the day as characterized by repeated armoured clashes, heavy artillery exchanges, and rapid shifts between attack and defence. Despite these efforts, the balance of forces and the operational situation favoured continued Soviet progress. Soviet commanders accepted local setbacks, but maintained the overall direction of their main blow, feeding additional regiments into the sector where reconnaissance reported the weakest resistance. Engineers worked under fire to repair roads and bridge smaller rivers, so that artillery and supporting vehicles could close up to the leading units. Air formations intensified their activity, attacking crossroads and assembly areas where German reserves attempted to form up for new counterattacks. The result was an attritional struggle, in which German armoured units lost vehicles and fuel faster than they could be replaced, while Soviet formations, though also taking significant losses, continued to advance. For Memel and its surroundings, the 10th and 11th of October marked a turning point. The port, already important for supply, now became a focal point for evacuation of personnel and material from areas east of the city. Quays and warehouses filled with military cargo, administrative archives, and wounded soldiers waiting for transport. Naval units planned for the possibility that land routes would be cut, calculating how many tons could be moved by sea under threat from Soviet aircraft and submarines. Local civilians observed increased movement of ships, columns of vehicles heading toward the harbour, and the establishment of new defensive positions on the landward approaches to the city. On 11th October, forward detachments of 1st Baltic Front reached the Baltic shoreline north of Memel. This contact with the sea completed the operational goal that had shaped the entire offensive. The land connection between German forces in Latvia and those in East Prussia was severed. German units north of the breakthrough, still numbering several 100,000 men when all formations of Army Group North were counted, now depended on coastal ports and naval shipping for supply and any future evacuation. Field reports from German headquarters recorded the event in concise terms. Connection interrupted, communications by land no longer possible, but the implications were far-reaching. High command decisions, at this moment, defined the character of the new situation. Proposals from some German staff officers to withdraw major elements from the newly formed pocket by sea and redeploy them closer to the Reich met with limited approval. Directives from the political leadership emphasized holding Baltic positions, both for their symbolic value and for their perceived role in tying down Soviet forces. In Soviet documentation, the achievement of the breakthrough and the arrival at the sea were recorded as confirmation that the main operational aim had been fulfilled. Army Group North was now isolated in what would become known as the Courland Pocket, and future operations could be planned on the assumption that its movements were constrained by geography and by reliance on vulnerable sea lines of communication. For the German forces now enclosed between the Baltic Sea and the advancing Red Army, the isolation imposed a rapid need to adapt. The formations that had constituted Army Group North were reorganized to defend a reduced perimeter in western Latvia and parts of the Courland Peninsula. Defensive lines were traced along rivers, forests, and ridges, with multiple belts of trenches, bunkers and minefields planned to absorb Soviet blows. Infantry divisions, including German units and locally raised Latvian formations, redistributed to cover critical sectors, while remaining armoured and assault gun units were positioned as mobile reserves behind likely breakthrough points. Sea communications became the defining feature of this new situation. The Baltic ports, particularly Liepāja and Ventspils, turned into hubs for both supply and evacuation. German naval staff calculated the tonnage required to maintain several 100,000 troops with ammunition, fuel, and food, while also reserving capacity to move wounded, specialists, and some civilians toward East Prussia or German ports. Convoys assembled under the protection of mines, coastal batteries, and escort vessels, but remained vulnerable to Soviet submarines and aircraft. The result was a continuous balancing act, maintaining enough shipping capacity to sustain the pocket, while also using available vessels to reinforce other threatened sectors of the front. Soviet command also adjusted to the new configuration. With the land corridor cut, fronts operating in the Baltic sector now faced an enemy whose maneuver options were geographically constrained, but still substantial in manpower and equipment. Operational plans envisaged a series of offensives to compress and, if possible, eliminate the pocket. At the same time, the Soviet leadership judged that the primary direction of effort lay farther south, toward the Vistula, the Oder, and ultimately Berlin. Accordingly, several experienced formations and heavy artillery units were gradually redeployed from the Baltic to other fronts, leaving enough forces in place to contain and periodically attack the Courland positions. On the ground, both sides experimented with tactics suited to this evolving balance. German units worked to improve camouflage, construct deeper shelters against artillery and air attack, and prepare counterattack routes through forests and along sandy tracks. Training emphasized rapid movement from reserve positions to threatened sectors, since divisions could no longer rely on large operational withdrawals. Soviet troops, facing entrenched defenders on a limited front, increased the use of reconnaissance in force, sapping, and concentrated artillery on narrow sectors, before launching infantry assaults supported by tanks where terrain allowed. The psychological dimension of adaptation was visible in soldiers' experiences. For many German and Latvian troops in the pocket, isolation produced a mixture of uncertainty and routine. Mail and news arrived by sea, reinforcing the sense of separation from other fronts. Soldiers knew that their only landward route led through Soviet positions, while the sea offered both a lifeline and a potential route of evacuation, whose availability depended on decisions far above their level. Soviet troops opposite them understood that the forces they confronted could not be easily bypassed, but also that the main strategic decision had already been taken when the corridor was cut. Their task was to press, contain, and wear down, even as some of their comrades were transferred south for operations deemed more decisive. Civilians in Courland adapted to prolonged frontline conditions. Latvian towns and villages experienced successive waves of requisitions, billeting and fortification work. Some residents were evacuated by ship, especially those connected to German administration or military families. Others remained, cultivating small plots, repairing damaged buildings where possible, and navigating changing local regulations. For those who stayed, the war manifested as periodic bombardments, population movements through the ports, and the visible presence of both German and auxiliary units preparing defences. At higher levels, the decision to hold the pocket rather than conduct a large-scale evacuation represented a form of strategic adaptation shaped by political considerations. Maintaining a substantial force group in Courland allowed German leadership to claim that large Soviet formations were tied down away from central sectors, and that Baltic ports and sea lanes remained in their hands. Soviet leaders, evaluating costs and priorities, adapted in a different way. Instead of committing maximum resources to immediate reduction of the pocket, they integrated operations against Courland into a broader sequence aimed at East Prussia and Central Poland. In this interplay of choices, resistance and adaptation on both sides turned Courland from a temporary encirclement into a long-term theatre that would persist into the final months of the war. For German command, the days immediately after the breakthrough to the Baltic marked a moment when operational assessments and political directives diverged sharply. Situation reports from Army Group North and 3rd Panzer Army described an encircled force of several 100,000 men in Latvia and Courland, with no remaining land route to East Prussia. Staff officers outlined options: a staged evacuation by sea over several weeks, a breakout attempt toward the south, or the organisation of a long-term defensive bridgehead on the Baltic coast. Each option carried quantifiable risks in terms of shipping capacity, fuel consumption, expected losses, and the impact on other fronts. Conferences in the German High Command in mid-October 1944 examined these options in detail. Naval representatives presented calculations of how many troops and how much equipment could be moved per week from Courland ports, taking into account the availability of transport ships, escort vessels and fuel stocks, as well as the growing activity of Soviet submarines and aircraft in the Baltic. Army planners warned that a large-scale evacuation would require stable port areas and relatively calm weather, and that any Soviet offensive coinciding with a loading operation could lead to high losses among troops waiting on quays and roads. Others argued that attempting a breakout toward East Prussia across territory already under Soviet control would demand concentrations of armour and air support that no longer existed in sufficient strength in the region. Within this framework, Adolf Hitler's decision was to retain a substantial force group in Courland rather than authorize an immediate large-scale withdrawal. The reasoning combined military and political considerations. Keeping several armies in Courland offered the prospect of tying down a significant number of Soviet divisions, guns and aircraft away from central sectors. It preserved German control over a stretch of Baltic coastline and ports that could still serve as bases for naval units and as evacuation points for civilians and selected personnel. Politically, abandoning the Baltic area, which had been held since 1941, was viewed as undesirable, both for internal morale and for the message it would send to allies and occupied populations. For Soviet command, the same development prompted a different kind of turning point. Once the land corridor had been cut and Army Group North was restricted to the Courland region, Stavka reassessed priorities across the Eastern Front. While operations to compress the pocket remained on the agenda, the main direction of effort shifted toward East Prussia, Central Poland, and the Vistula-Oder axis. Orders in late October and November 1944 transferred several experienced rifle and tank formations, as well as heavy artillery and air units, from the Baltic sector to fronts preparing for large offensives toward Königsberg and the German heartland. Courland was redesignated as a secondary theatre, where the goal was containment and periodic pressure, rather than immediate elimination of all encircled forces. On the ground, these high-level decisions altered the expectations of those inside and outside the pocket. German and Latvian units in Courland began to construct more permanent defensive systems, with multiple trench lines, dugouts, and artillery positions designed for prolonged occupation. The prospect of a near-term breakout diminished as orders emphasized holding prepared lines and repelling Soviet attacks. Naval evacuation continued, but on a scale calibrated to remove wounded, specialists, and selected civilians rather than entire field armies. For many soldiers, the understanding emerged that they were to remain in place as long as higher command considered it useful, with the sea as supply route but no guaranteed passage to the west. Opposite them, Soviet troops recognized that the decisive outcome of the October operation lay less in the immediate capture of ground in Courland than in the strategic effect of isolating a major enemy grouping. Letters and reports from units later redeployed south reflected an awareness that the corridor's closure had reshaped the map of the Eastern Front, even though the encircled forces continued to resist. Civilians in Latvia and along the Baltic coast experienced the turning point through practical changes. Some towns became long-term garrison and port centers under German control, while areas south and east shifted to Soviet administration and integration into wider plans for post-war governance. Thus, the moment when Soviet forces reached the Baltic near Mamel and German leadership chose to hold, rather than evacuate Courland, defined the subsequent character of the Northern Theatre. What might have been a brief encirclement, followed by rapid liquidation instead, became a prolonged situation in which a large German force remained isolated but active, influencing Soviet deployments and shaping the final campaigns in East Prussia and Central Europe. By late 1944 and into the first months of 1945, the fighting in Courland settled into a pattern of repeated offensives and counteroffensives that did not fundamentally alter the strategic situation created by the October breakthrough. Soviet forces launched a series of major attacks, commonly counted as 6 Courland offensives, aimed at compressing the pocket, seizing key transport hubs and ports, and forcing the capitulation or destruction of the encircled armies. Each offensive brought heavy artillery preparation, infantry assaults, and localized tank actions. Each was met by German defensive efforts that combined entrenched positions, counterattacks by remaining mobile units, and intensive use of artillery and mortars. The results were measurable in casualties and territorial adjustments, rather than in decisive transformations. Soviet units advanced in some sectors, capturing villages, ridges, and parts of defensive belts, and pushing the front line closer to ports and railways. German after-action reports counted divisions reduced by thousands of men, shortages of ammunition in prolonged engagements, and the progressive loss of experienced junior officers. Soviet formations also recorded high losses in assaults against fortified lines, minefields, and prepared strongpoints. For Latvian soldiers serving in German units, the campaigns meant successive battles fought over familiar terrain without a clear prospect of withdrawal or return to civilian life. Naval evacuation continued throughout this period, though not on a scale sufficient to remove entire field armies. German shipping moved tens of thousands of wounded specialists and selected units from Courland to East Prussia and other Baltic ports. Some combat formations were withdrawn in stages, replenished, and thrown into battles closer to the German heartland. At the same time, new units and replacements still moved into Courland by sea, reflecting the continued intention to hold the pocket as a fortified bridgehead. For many soldiers, the possibility of evacuation remained uncertain and dependent on orders that might never come. Civilians experienced the drawn-out nature of the pocket as prolonged exposure to frontline conditions. In towns like Liepāja and Ventspils, populations fluctuated as evacuees arrived, and departures by ship were organized. Housing, food supplies, and medical services were under strain. In rural areas, farms lay close to fortified zones. Fields were cut by trenches and barbed wire, and agricultural work took place under the constraints of requisitions and movement restrictions. Some families left by sea or with withdrawing units. Others stayed, adjusting to shortages and the presence of fortifications in their immediate surroundings. For Soviet-controlled territories outside the pocket, the ending phase of the war brought a different pattern of aftermath. As the Red Army advanced into East Prussia, Poland, and eventually toward Berlin, the Baltic regions south and east of Courland was gradually integrated into Soviet administrative structures. New political bodies, security organs, and economic plans were introduced, focusing on reconstruction, land reform, and the consolidation of Soviet power. The Courland pocket, while still active as a military theatre, increasingly appeared in wider Soviet reporting as a contained problem, secondary to the operations that carried the war into German territory. The final act came in May 1945, when the general German capitulation included the forces in Courland. At that point, estimates of the remaining German and Allied troops in the pocket ranged in the hundreds of thousands. These soldiers laid down their arms and became prisoners of war, to be transported to camps and labor sites across the Soviet Union. Latvian and other local personnel serving in German units faced processes of screening, detention, or conscription into new structures depending on their roles and the policies applied by Soviet authorities. The ports and towns that had served as hubs of supply and evacuation were taken over by Soviet military and administrative bodies, marking the transition from active combat to occupation and reconstruction. Immediate consequences of the pocket's persistence and eventual surrender were thus distributed across several dimensions. Militarily, large numbers of troops and quantities of equipment were removed from the war only at its very end, having spent months in a theatre whose strategic outcome had been decided when the land connection was cut. Economically and socially, the Courland region and wider Baltic area bore the marks of fortification, evacuation, bombardment, and shifting administrations. For those who had lived and fought there, the withdrawal, surrender, and occupation did not resolve questions about the future status of the region, but marked the beginning of a new phase shaped by post-war policies and alignments. In later evaluations of the Eastern Front, the October 1944 breakthrough to the Baltic and the subsequent Courland pocket were interpreted through different lenses by the parties involved and by later historians. German post-war accounts often emphasized the numerical and material pressure facing Army Group North and argued that holding Courland tied down multiple Soviet armies that might otherwise have been deployed earlier against East Prussia or the approaches to Berlin. They pointed to force estimates at surrender of several 100,000 German and Allied troops in Courland and comparable numbers of Soviet personnel committed at various phases of the containment, as evidence that the pocket remained operationally relevant until May 1945. Other analyses noted that many Soviet units were progressively withdrawn from the Baltic sector, suggesting that the tying down effect, while real, was limited by broader strategic priorities. Soviet-era narratives highlighted the October operation as an example of successful operational encirclement. By cutting the land corridor near Memel and reaching the Baltic coast around 10 to 11 October, First Baltic Front transformed a continuous German front into a separated grouping that could no longer maneuver freely or support neighbouring armies. Official histories stressed the coordination between Baltic fronts and the concentration of artillery, armour and air power that enabled the breakthrough. At the same time, they framed subsequent operations in Courland as necessary but subordinate to the main offensives toward East Prussia, the Vistula and the Oder, underlining that the strategic decision had been effectively taken when the corridor was severed. For Latvian society and other Baltic populations, the legacy took a different form. The Courland battlefield became a symbol of both prolonged fighting on local soil and of repeated changes in authority. Tens of thousands of local residents had experienced conscription into German units, evacuation by sea, or integration into Soviet structures after the front passed. The landscape retained traces of trenches, bunkers and minefields long after the war. In the post-war decades, official Soviet commemoration emphasized liberation and the role of Soviet units. Family memories and private accounts, however, often focused on loss, displacement, and the complexity of choices made under occupation by two major powers. Within the broader German war effort, the decision to maintain large forces in Courland has been examined alongside other cases where garrisons were held in encircled or semi-encircled positions, including fortress cities and coastal pockets. Analysts have compared the resources required to supply Courland by sea, sustain its defences, and conduct repeated local offensives with the potential benefits of redeploying part of those troops to reinforce East Prussia, the Vistula line, or the defence of central Germany. Some argue that the retention of Courland reflected a preference for holding symbolically and politically important regions and demonstrating endurance, even when options for decisive manoeuvre had narrowed. Others stress the constraints of available shipping exposure to air and submarine attack, and the difficulty of moving hundreds of thousands of troops under late war conditions, suggesting that complete evacuation may not have been feasible within the remaining time frame. For the Soviet side, the long-term significance of the Courland pocket lay in both military and political outcomes. Militarily, the pocket ensured that a large German grouping did not withdraw in an organized fashion to reinforce later defensive lines closer to the Reich. Politically, the progressive isolation and eventual surrender of Courland coincided with the re-establishment of Soviet control over the Baltic republics and their incorporation into post-war plans for territorial and political order. The presence of German forces in Courland until May 1945 and their final capitulation formed part of the narrative that the war in the Baltic region ended only with the general collapse of the Third Reich. Contemporary historiography treats the October 1944 breakthrough to the Baltic and the creation of the Courland pocket as a case study in the interaction between operational success, logistical constraints, and political decision-making. On the one hand, the Soviet operation that reached the sea near Memel demonstrated how carefully planned and resourced offensives could achieve strategic encirclement over a wide front. On the other hand, the German decision to hold Courland rather than evacuate or mount a large breakout illustrates how leadership evaluated military options through the lens of wider political and symbolic considerations. The result was a prolonged encirclement in which hundreds of thousands of soldiers and large civilian populations remained in a theatre whose ultimate outcome had been defined when the land connection was cut in October 1944. In this sense, the legacy of the Courland pocket links frontline experiences with larger debates about late-war strategy. For soldiers on both sides, the months following the breakthrough meant continued combat, supply efforts, and uncertainty until the general surrender in May 1945. For civilians, they meant evacuation, reconstruction, and integration into new state structures. For later observers, Courland remains an example of how decisions made in response to an operational crisis can lock belligerents into long-lasting configurations where the human and material costs accumulate long after the decisive geographical objective, in this case, the cutting of the land bridge to the Baltic, has been achieved.